Anomalies. My name is Jules, and today we're going to be talking about 4 of the basic biological concepts that I think are really important when you're talking about biochemistry. Now, keep in mind, I am not a professional. In fact, I'm still a student myself, and this is my quarterly assessment for this 9 weeks for my biology class. What are we talking about, you may ask? Let me lay down the bases. We're going to be talking about the characteristics of living things. We're going to be talking about what the heck prokaryotes and eukaryotes are. We're going to be talking about bonding, and we're finally going to be talking about the properties of water, one of the coolest inorganic materials on this earth, and what makes it so awesome. Now, let me introduce you to my four-lifer, Mrs. H. Gren. Quite literally a four-lifer, considering that each of the initials in her name stand for a different characteristic of living things. M. M stands for movement, whether that is internal or external. Internal means the circulation of materials within the body, and external means locomotion from one place to another. We got R, which stands for reproduction. Don't worry, I'll say the nitty-gritty details for health class, but essentially what you need to know is that all organisms reproduce in some way, whether that is asexually or sexually. If it's asexual, then it requires just one parent cell, which will make another cell that has the exact same genetic material as the parent one. If it's sexually, it requires 2 parent cells, and they will combine and they will make a genetically different offspring. Next we have S, which stands for sensitivity, which means that the organism responds to stimuli or changes in the environment. An example of this is when you touch a hot stove, your hand automatically moves away so that you don't get burned, because it knows that hot equals bad. So despite what some people say, it's good to be sensitive. Now we got the H. The H stands for homeostasis, which means that the organism keeps everything the same within itself. Next, we have G, which stands for growth and development. Growth means that the organism gets bigger over time, and development means that it changes emotionally, behaviorally, and physically. This happens to all organisms across their lifetime. Next is R. R stands for respiration, which means that we release energy from the food that we consume. E stands for excretion, which means the removal of waste that we don't need, such as urinating. And finally, we have N, which stands for nutrition, which essentially means that all organisms need some type of food to stay alive and gain energy, whether that is getting energy from the sun or eating an antelope. We've learned what makes something living, we can talk about the different kinds of cells we'll see in our natural world. There are 2 types of cells. There are prokaryotes and there are eukaryotes. Prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, which is essentially like the brain of the cell, and eukaryotes do have a nucleus. Basically, the gist is that prokaryotes have way less organelles than eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are way more complex. Some examples of prokaryotes are algae and bacteria, things you can find all around you. And some examples of eukaryotic cells are plant and animal cells. Now that we've covered all that stuff, let's talk about bonding. Now you ask, what are the different kinds of bonding? Well, there are 3 main types: covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonding. Covalent bonds are when 2 atoms share electrons. They keep them really tight-knit and they're hard to break. Another kind is ionic bonding. This is when an atom either gains or loses electrons, depending on how many it has in its valence shell at the time. And finally, the weakest is hydrogen bonding. Now, this is the weakest because the hydrogens in the atom have a slight positive charge, and then the other molecule has a slight negative charge, and they attract to each other, but they don't really match. So it sticks together, but it's easy to break. Bonding is pretty cool. But let's talk about the coolest inorganic material on this earth, which is water. One of the properties of water is that it is polar, which means that water molecules have slight charges. It also means that it can dissolve other polar substances like salt. That's why when you shake up salt in a glass of water, it'll dissolve. But it can't dissolve non-polar substances such as oil. That's why they don't mix. Another property of water is that it is very adhesive, which means it can stick to other things. Another thing about water is that it's cohesive, which, like being adhesive, means that it sticks to itself. It's a true ambivert, just like me. When cohesion and adhesion work together, it creates 2 of the other properties of water: One of them is capillary action, which is when water will stick to itself and will stick to the sides and will climb up the stem of a plant, reaching the water that it needs. Another thing that it does is its surface tension, which is the water will stick to itself and stick to the surface, creating a sort of bubble. Do you ever notice it takes a long time for water to boil? Well, that's because water needs a lot of energy to boil, because it's what's something called a high specific heat. Because of that, it helps regulate the Earth's climate, because we are mostly made up of water. When water reaches its freezing point, it turns to ice, as I'm sure you know. Now, ice is less dense than water, which means it'll float actually on top of the water. And because it does this, it helps us so many parts of our environment, such as when in the winter, it'll freeze over top and the water below will stay liquidy and fish and other animals can still live down there. I'm sure you know this, Mom, but water conducts electricity. So do not have a wet hand and an open socket and do not put them together. That will not be fun for you. And finally, something I think is really cool about water is that it is something called universal solvent. Now, when I first heard this, I thought, oh, that makes no sense. There's no way water can dissolve everything. And that is true, but it can dissolve one of the most things out of pretty much any liquid. That's why it's called the universal solvent. All right, I think we're done. I really hope you enjoyed this video and it was a lot of fun to make. I'd love to do something like this more often. And if you learned something from this video, leave a comment, give suggestions of other things I should talk about. And if you're my teacher watching, I hope you enjoyed as well. Have a good night.